Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of our web series training and about training in media. Made by LGM Digital. This episode is called Training Engineering You Will Discover. So I'm Gilles Baudoux. I'm a training technical manager in our Directorate of Technical Innovation.
And I'm Ianis CHARED. I'm a training engineer, and I work on different training programs for defense and railway at every step of development of a training program that we're going to present you. So today we are going to start speaking about the ADDI model, which is the backbone of our methodology that we are applying for the training program that we are performing for clients. We are going to speak about the analysis parts, especially, and the design parts also, which are the first two layers of the model. And we are going to go on after that with the media selection supporting tool that we developed within LGM based on our experience in training engineering. And we will conclude that webinar just after.
Thank you, Ianis. A small recall about our methodology. So we already talked about it in our first episode, but just a quick recall to make sure everyone is on the same page. So the ADDIE model is composed of 5 phases. The first phase is the analysis phase. During that phase, we will define the training states according to the context of an organization. So all parameters influencing the training, and we will define the general objective, so the training purpose. The second phase is the design phase. During that phase, we will determine the learning objectives. We will structure them in a training path, and we will select the adequate training media to broadcast the training message. The third phase is the development. That phase is simply the production of the training material and the different training supports. The fourth phase is the implementation phase. During that phase, we will broadcast the media through an LMS, a learning management system, for example, or we will conduct the training. The last phase is the evaluation phase. That phase allows to evaluate the training quality and efficiency based, for example, on the satisfaction of the learners about the training or the validation of the acquisition of the knowledge, or even more, we can also evaluate the ROI, the return on investment, or the ROE, the return on expectations of the training.
So for the first analysis phase, which aim is to define the training stakes based on the different parameter of the program. We are going to start with 2 analyses. The first one is the organization needs. We are going then to take into account the need of training for the jobs that we are guessing evolving. We are going to take into account the operational context, which is different between different companies and different organizations. And we are going then to take into account the requirement and the constraints of the training program. Those provide parameters and input data that are going to define our training program based on where we want the trainees to go. That helps us to define the profiles of the people that we are going to train, to make sure that the training is in accordance with the performance and strategic objectives of the organization. And we will then consider the conduct of the training in regard of the context and the logistics that go with setting up a project, a training project like that. And aside of the organization, there is one of the key points is to assess the learning population, to identify where they are in regard of knowledge, skills, and attitude, to be able to compare that in regard of where we want them to be at the end. And so therefore we have an idea of the path to go. But also we want to be sure that they understand the path to go. So therefore, we are also identifying and trying to understand their own understanding of their future roles and activity to be sure that we are going on the same path. And in regard of that, and for this webinar, we are going to put everything in perspective with one of our major training program, which is the AXE program, and I will let Gilles present it.
Yes, we try to illustrate all theoretical concepts we are presenting you with the AXE LOC1 project situation. It's a project that we led since 15 years now. It's a project about the project is the development and deployment of a air command and control system, so AXE. This system is used by the military, and so it's bought by NATO and installed on 15 nations' sites, military sites. It's a very large program, very important for NATO. And in that program, we have to provide all the training, meaning making all the steps of the ADI model for the training of this about this system. We train all operators, but also all technicians, and so far we have trained 1,700 learners. The challenge of this, the challenges of this project is that there are many different roles. In total, we have 35 roles to cover. As Ianis said, in the analysis phase, we analyze all the roles which are candidates, which are dedicated to be trained. So those roles, they go. They start from surveillance operators, air controllers, people in charge of air mission planning. So that's for the operation part. For the technical part, we talk about communications manager. We talk about system administrator, different maintenance roles, and so on. Also, as you can imagine, that it's a very broad program from Portugal to Norway, from Turkey to Greece, going through Belgium, Netherlands, France. We have very, very different learners' profiles that we need to take into account. Even if the countries are closed, I can assure you that providing training to Netherlanders is not the same as providing training to a Belgian people. So we have to take that into account. And also inside the different military sites, there are also very, very different profiles. So that's why this characterization of the populations is very, very important.
So after taking into account the characteristics of the organization and to have analyzed the profile, there is a need to be able to perform that part of the analysis in regard of the new tasks that are going to be performed by the learners inside of the future organization, and therefore we need to. There is a need to perform a thorough analysis on those tasks to know exactly the roles and the jobs that are going to be impacted and how. And during that analysis, we are going to break down those tasks in subtasks up to action that we will be able to link in the design phase to learning objective to build the training path. So to be able to build those task analysis, to perform that task analysis, we are going to one reliable way to do is to interview SMEs, subject matter experts, that are going to that are usually the backbones of the knowledge of the future training to be developed and to be performed. And we can interview them, we can work with them, and especially we can observe them in the situation of performing the activity that we need to train other people on. So we are able to perform that kind of activity, to be able to analyze fully the different tasks. But we are also observing people and personnel that are more similar to the learners pools that we will train later on, to be able also to adapt the design and the development of the training for them. And we also basing ourselves in regard of job description and documentation that are usually at the starting point of the training program.
Yes, and so to illustrate that, how this task analysis is important, in regards of the ACTS program, let's consider two different countries. For example, Hungary and France. France has a very large air force capability, while Hungary has a more limited air force capability. So with different approach, different doctrine, different means. So the France has a lot of different means: air-to-air refueling, a lot of radar, aircraft carrying radars. Hungary has a very small air force with only some fighters and so on. So let's imagine a this system ACTS is very large in terms of functionalities. It covers all the functionalities required to manage and to control air missions and air defense. So, for example, for a country like France, they will almost use 100% of the functions of ACTS, but Hungary, maybe they need 40–50% of the functions, just because they don't have the same use of the system. The use of the system is determined also by their operational context, by their strategic context. That's why a task analysis of the roles dedicated to training in France won't be the same won't be the same as the role for Hungarian people. Doing this task analysis will allow to develop a tailored training, a very custom-made training to each role, depending of the operational context, depending of their working environment. And that's very important, and that's make a big difference of doing a training just based on the equipment, on the system functionalities, where it's an off-the-shelf training and not and it doesn't take into consideration the specifics of each country or each size. And here, with this method, with the task analysis, we ensure that the training scope is justified and very precise to answer the learners' needs. And all those, all this task analysis, we have performed it during this project with being in contact with our experts, which were for some of them also former military, former air controllers. They did the exchange with the different subject matter experts of the sites. They analyzed the job on the sites. They analyzed the doctrine of the sites, just to make sure we understood very clearly, and we took into account the specifics of each sites.
So the next step after performing the analysis is starting to design the training program. So we are taking into account all of the data that we gather in the analysis phase, and we are able to start defining based on the action the learning objectives. And based on the analysis also of the population and the themes of the learning objective, we're able to to create categories and to identify the different level of competencies that are required at the beginning and that will be available at the end. And with all those different learning objectives, we're also able to create, to identify training materials and training media that can be used to complete those learning objectives. And by doing so, by the definition of training media, we are also leading to how we are going to evaluate. The evaluation of a traditional classroom is not going to be the same as assessing the knowledge at the end of an e-learning or after having performed a procedure on an equipment. Or on a virtual equipment by using either simulation or virtual reality, for example. And then when we have those learning objectives, those training media pools starting to be organized, we are able to start to organize all those elements into courses and lessons that make sense with one another and are in accordance with the training objectives of the organization identified at the beginning. And for those modules, we're able to define prerequisites that are going to be the entry door and the outcome for the trainers. And this will allow us to define a training path for one or several learners in regard of their starting knowledge and where we need to train them. And we are also able to adapt our training path in regard of the different training materials and media that we are going to select to provide more of a blended learning approach that will allow us to, at the same time, as we recommend, have short, intense training that are really going straight to the point, and that will be that will allow the learners and the trainees to keep motivation and stay focused all along the training program. That in some cases can be very long, as it's the case for the ACT program. And as I said, we like to mix, and we recommend to mix different learning media whenever possible, because we know that with different learning means there is different way to keep that information to itself. For example, by when an information is read, the memorization is around 10%. When it's seen, 30%. Read and heard, it's 50%, and when it's performed and lived, it's 90%. So we need to favor at the maximum extent the practice in the different kind of way possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes it's just not possible or not feasible. Therefore, having that blending learning approach with mixing different learning media at different stage and steps of the training path enable us and enable especially the learners at the end to be sure that they will be able to remember their training later on.
Yes, and to illustrate the design activities on ACT program, it's also on the ACT project. We also apply this blended learning approach So mixing theory, practice, exchange, evaluation, taking care of the prerequisite. I will explain you that. For example, to train an air controller, we started with a theory in classroom, explaining the different functions, the architecture of the system, and so on. But we went quickly to the practice because it was important to learn this new system, to practice it. But we defined a scenario very precisely according to this task analysis we talked previously. For example, we analyzed all the tasks of this role of air controller. There are tasks that they have to perform in peacetime, tasks they have to perform in wartime. As you know, there is no war. It's not war for the moment, and so we do not have a raid of 50 aircrafts coming from a country attacking another. We don't have that for the moment, but we have to train them on those functionalities, and these functionalities fulfill one of the tasks they have to perform. So we develop precise and complete scenario for simulation, simulated scenario that allowed to cover all the scope of the task and of the learning objectives they had to perform. Also, that was more or less the first phase in the factory. The second phase was a training on site, and that was more an exchange. So it means that our instructors, they were with the operators, with the air controllers on their side, taking into account their day-to-day job to integrate that into the training and exchange about the use of the system. Okay, you perform your job like this. Okay, I will show you how you can use the ACT system to perform your job. It was more a coaching on the job training, but through exchange. During at all the steps of the training, the competencies were evaluated through different means, theoretical test or practical test on the system. Another good example a good example of a prerequisite definition was the case with the administrator, the system administrator of the ACTS. The ACTS is based on a Linux Solaris platform that requires a basic knowledge of this operating system to perform the administration. As I said, there are 15 nations, 15 sites involved in this program with a lot of legacy systems, a lot of different people with different backgrounds. And so it was almost impossible to ensure that all the system administrators that are going to be trained will have the required level to enter the training. That's why we developed a prerequisite course for the people who need it. Before entering the system administration course, they had to follow 2 weeks or 3 weeks of training to make sure everyone is at the same level and that to ensure training efficiency. So to make sure that people will have the required level to follow all the subjects that will be seen. As Ianis explained, a very important step of the training design is the media selection. Today, as you know, we have a very large panel, a very large choice of media to cover the training. So we know the more classical one, like classroom instructor-led classes, like practical exercise on the system, on the equipment, like e-learning. It's a remote mean, but it's very known today and very very frequent to use it. We have also a video, we have a virtual reality, and within this panel, sometimes we don't know what to choose, what will be the most appropriate, the most adequate media to cover our objectives, taking into account our context. So that's why taking into account the characters of the population, taking into account the different context, the context and constraints of a training program, we develop a tool that analyze all those parameters, and through our tool, will provide a recommendation about the selection of the media that will apply for a training program. It does not replace the final human choice. It's just a recommendation, a support in the decision of for training engineers in order to cover this important step of the training design. And now I'll let Ianis presenting you this tool.
Thank you, Gilles. So I should just explain, it's a tool to be able to support decision, to make it. It's addressing two parts. The first is the overall tool, taking into account the overall characteristic of our training program. We can take them we can take all of them into account, and also make more precise and analysis on some specific learning objectives based on the requirement, where we want either to challenge ourselves or see if we can go on a different or confirm that we can go on a different usual path, let's say. So how does it work? So first, the main analysis is we call it the macro for the overall program. So with the LGM experience in training, in developing training, we started to gather knowledge on the different criteria selection, and that are important for that can be decisive. And we took them into account, and we started to identify how do they, based on those criteria, how does they influence the training program and the training media. And so this is the LGM engineering that is behind. So we already selected, we did that exercise as an example for the AXE program. And we selected the criteria that were important, and we identified the value behind them. So, and we can take a huge variety of parameters into account. And this list is extendable also. So in regard of the AXE program, we took into account the fact that the budget available was quite high. We didn't take into account range of budgets, because it's always depends on the overall program. When training thousands of people, the budget is going to be huge in regard of training 100 people. But still, in that situation, we had an important budget, for example. We take into account the amount of learners that we are available. That's influence the organization within the classroom and with the training paths. But within the classroom is quite important also, because it tailors also which training media are going to be suitable at every steps. We take into account the localization of the trainers. If they are located inside of one single location, for example, there is one training factory, training place for the program, for example, or do we have to split and spread the training, like it was the case for the last program, on the different NATO sites all over Europe? We take into account also the language spoken by the learners. Indeed, in some organization, different people are speaking different languages, and sometimes there is no really common ones, or at least sometimes English is not sufficient in regard of safety requirement, for example. And we want to be sure that we are addressing the training in the language of the learners. But in that case, we need to take into account the translation of the training media. And it does not have the same cost when we are translating practical procedures or traditional classroom presentation, and when we have to translate a whole simulator or virtual reality, for example. And we can take also into account the frequency of update of the training. A system that is meant to evolve every month or every couple of years does not require the same maintenance on its day of life and has an impact. So yeah, and on top of it, because those criteria are based on are based on LGM experience, but they also can be weights in regard of the specific requirement and constraints of the organization. For example, if there is some parameters that are more important than the other, we can perform that kind of, we can differentiate those parameters. What it leaves us is kind of an overall result. So for the training program, we'll be able to have, for each learning media that are going to be selected, there is a pool right here that I'm presenting you, but it can be augmented with any other. We are going to have for each learning media a result on a scale to -5 to 5, -5 being completely unsuitable and 5 being completely suitable, and 0 being neutral. And therefore, we can identify a tendency if a learning media is suitable or not. The idea of that is also sometimes to go outside of our bubble and not only stick with what we are used to, or not only stick with what is brand new. So here, for example, in that situation, we see that e-learning is quite important. Tutorial video can be quite helpful. Serious game, which can be similar to simulation based on the kind of activities that has to be performed, and tools are useful in that context. And definitely tool-based practice is a plus. So practicing. In real condition, whenever possible. And we are also doing, we can also do that, as I said, on specific learning objectives. So we took also the ACTS program into context, and we identified 2 learning objectives. The first one being how to perform a simple remove and replace on a redundant power applied inside of a computing rig. So there is another set of criteria that are taken into account for these learning objectives that we considered. And for this kind of procedures, for example, on the criteria, we have the reuse requirement of that training. We know that in the NATO organization, there is a huge turnover in regard of in the IT department, and that the training will need to be conducted on a regular basis. That task does not require specific knowledge, not more than the job description of the learners. There is a requirement there is a need of skills and therefore of practice, and not especially on behaviors. However, and therefore, when we want to go on the next step on practicing, there is a question of the availability of the equipment that we need to take into account. In that case, a power supply on a redundant computing bay is quite available because, first of all, it's redundant on the system. So let's imagine that on a good situation, we can consider to perform on a short time period the procedure. We are able to go back on an initial stage quite fast if needed, but we also have spares, and therefore that can be used to perform that and to train on that procedures. The task complexity is complicated in that situation. The removing and replacing itself, not so much, but we need to take into account the fact that it's quite a specific environment. There is electrical safety to take into account. There is loaded equipment with static electricity around, and so yeah, it's a complicated one. However, more than that, even with the risks to be taken into account, because it's not more than the usual rules to be followed for those actions, the risk for the learners is low, and the risk for the equipment is quite low. It has been designed that way. Therefore, when we see the result for that learning objectives, we are seeing that, of course, a tool-based practice is can be really as a good way to go. But we have also the augmented reality that is brought up. And we can understand that. As I said, it's a complicated, it can be a complicated procedure in regard of all the steps to be applied before and after, in regard of where the power supply is. And therefore, the augmented reality can bring in that situation additional information while repeating and performing the training to be sure that all those elements are taken into account and are remembered by the learners at the end when we will be trained and when we will perform the action live. And we also developed the learning objectives for another procedure that I will present shortly. It's the case of a reconfiguration of the network card using Unix terminal. The difference with that is that the requirement in regard of knowledge is higher than before. We need advanced administrators to perform that kind of action. The availability of the equipment is quite low. Those cards are quite expensive and there is not much spare, but also there is not much, there is a lack of availability of a representative environment to perform that action. And at the same time, the task is really complex based on the knowledge that are required. Risk for the learners, none. But risk for the equipment, it can be high if it has not been performed properly. It can create, it can have a big impact after when the system goes live, as an example, during that procedures. And therefore, even if everything is installed, it can lead to a problematic situation. And therefore, we see that here, in that case, in regard of the result, there is more emphasis on the learnings beforehand, so the e-learnings, the tutorial videos that can be really helpful for the different steps, and that can support the learner, the trainee, to perform the different steps. But we can still we can still keep the practice that is still useful, and we have the serious game that is equal to a simulation. So if we are able to set up representative environment, we can train in that configuration. So this tool enables us to perform those kind of analysis and to support initial identification of learning media, to confirm them, or to identify maybe other options. And I will let Gilles go on. That's it for this tool.
Thank you, Ianis. So to conclude on this design phase, all the steps we have performed will be summarized, all the steps you have performed and the result, the outcome of all this analytical approach performed during the analysis and design phase will be summarized in the training plan. And I would like also to emphasize the added value of the analysis and design phase, the first phase of this methodology, is that, as you have seen, as we start with a role and task analysis, it ensures the exhaustivity in covering the training needs. Also, thanks to this task analysis, we have a justification, a rationale for each learning objectives, and with our tool, we select the adequate media. So, as we took into account the population characteristics and the roles organizational characteristics, there is a consistency between the training plan and the operational context that ensures that the learners, they will feel concerned, they will feel involved in the training. They will feel that this training is in accordance with their day-to-day needs. As we have made a specification upstream of the development phase, the development phase is optimized because everything is set up, everything is specified before we start the development. So you earn time while doing the development of the training media, and also you identify, thanks to this precise definition of learning objective for each role, you identify where you can reuse the different modules for each role. So to conclude, a small drawing. So we have seen in the analysis phase that we do a role and task analysis. We also characterize the learners' population, and we take into account the operational context and the organizational constraints. Having all those data, we perform the design phase, meaning defining the learning objective and structuring them into training paths, and with our tool selecting the adequate learning media. All the work we performed in the analysis and design phase is summarized in the training plan, and this training plan is the, let's say, the definition and the commitment for the next phases, so the development, implementation, and evaluation. So that concludes this episode. I really want to thank you sincerely for your presence and your interest. Now, before saying goodbye, we have time for some questions. So let's check if we have questions. Yes, there is one question. So the question is that if the media selection tool is available and can be used by our customers. Actually, it is available, and of course we can share it with you. But we won't sell just the tool like this. We think that it needs a support to adapt the tool to your organization, to probably set up some workshops with your training engineers to check that if the media, the different media is according to what you propose in your training program, first of all, and also to make sure that the algorithm is adapted to your way of working and to your experience simply. So yes, we have this tool available, but within projects we can lead with it. I don't see any other questions so far. So thank you again, goodbye, and I let the final word to Ianis.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope we'll be able to work together on your next training program. Bye.
Bye-bye.